Good evening. Thank you for joining Japan Foundation London's online event. My name is Junko Takekawa, Senior Arts Program Officer of Japan Foundation London. Without doubt, Studio Ghibli is one of Japan's cultural icons. From Totoro to Howl's Moving Castle and Princess Momonoke, their animation has grabbed tons of people's hearts, creating a global phenomenon. I'm not saying this because of today's event, but one of my favorite works by Ghibli is actually Grave of the Fireflies, a quite realistic war film that makes me cry every time I watch it. And then some scenes are so unforgettable. But I wasn't aware until Alex Dubok de Witt approached us with his new book on this work that this superb animation hasn't received the same popularity as other Studio Ghibli works. This is, to be honest, a heartbreaking discovery for me. Therefore, I was delighted to know that today's main speaker, Alex Dudok de Witt, had in his new book examined the importance of this work and of Takahata Isao, who was somehow overshadowed by the other giant creator, Miyazaki Hayao. In this talk, Alex, a journalist specializing in animation, introducing the contents of his book and later discusses with Dr. Yoshioka Shiro, Newcastle University, who is also an anime expert, as to the perception of and the issues surrounding Grave of the Fireflies. I hope today's session will give an opportunity to revisit this unfairly underrated animation work, which should be passed down from generation to generation. Next is Housekeeping Matters. Today's event will be recorded. As we are using a webinar function, your names will not be viewable by other attendees. However, I strongly recommend you to keep your audio and video muted throughout, just in case. If you have any questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A function. You can see the icon at the bottom of the screen to send in your question at any time. Remember that attendees' questions may be seen by everyone else so that you can vote a particular question pressed by another person which you'd like to answer, or if it's the same as yours. Simply click the thumb up icon next to the question you wish to upvote. Unfortunately, due to time restriction, we may not be able to pick up all the questions you asked, so my apologies in advance. Lastly, as always, we will send you an online questionnaire, so please spare a short moment to complete it for a future event. That's all from me. Thank you so much for attending again. Now I'd like to welcome Alex to talk about his book and then present it. Alex.
Thank you very much, Junko, and thank you for all being here and devoting an hour of your evening to listen to me talk about this traumatic film. I assume that most of you are familiar with it, but just in case, I'll very briefly recap. So Grave of the Fireflies was released in Japan in 1988. Darian, actually, if we could have the first slide. Well, the very first slide is the cover of the book, for which we've pinched the DVD's cover image, with permission, of course. And if we could have the next slide. Now, this illustrates something unusual about the history of Grave of the Fireflies, which is that it was released in Japanese cinemas as part of a double bill with the much sunnier My Neighbour Totoro. So they came out as a double bill. This is a promotional pamphlet from the time. And Grave of the Fireflies was directed by Isao Takahata, as Junko said, who, along with Hayao MIYAZAKI, were kind of creatively led Studio Ghibli for many decades. It was based on a kind of semi-autobiographical novella by the great post-war Japanese writer Akiyuki Nosaka. Darian, please, the next slide. So there we have them. Top left, Takahata, looking pensive. Bottom right, Nosaka, looking pensive. The story, as I said, semi-autobiographical, kind of based on Nosaka's, actually both artists' experiences of the Second World War. So we have two siblings, 14-year-old Seita and his infant sister Setsuko, who who are orphaned in an American firebomb raid on their home in Kobe, and who then kind of fend for themselves in the dying days of the war, but don't make it and end up dying. I'm going to start by briefly talking about my personal history with the film. So I first saw it when I was Seita's age, 14, in Japan, where I was traveling with my family. And we saw it in a screening room adjoining a museum in Osaka that was dedicated to marginalized people in Japan and the activism that surrounds them. And I remember thinking at the time that it seemed like a strange marriage, because Grave of the Fireflies is not about these marginalized people at all. But then much later, when I had kind of thought much more about the film and knew more about its making, I realized that part of the film is a kind of subversive commentary on Japanese society. And this actually matches quite well with this museum that was in its own way critical of the Japanese state and Japanese society. So we saw this film, and what really impressed me on that first viewing was the fact that this history had happened at all. I'd learned at school about the Second World War, but really through the prism of the European war with the Nazis and the French invasion and the UK and so on. But we hadn't learned about the Japanese experience of the war. And I was kind of shocked to realize that the country I'd just been traveling around had only 60 years previously been razed to the ground by American bombs. So that made a huge impression on me. So went back to the UK, and as it happens, this was just about the time when the Ghibli back catalogue was starting to get released in the UK for the first time, and Grave of the Fireflies had just got its first release here in a DVD form. So I got the DVD and continued watching it. Something happened between my first viewing and my second viewing, which is that I misremembered the story, and I thought it was a film about the A-bomb, the atom bomb dropped on Hiroshima. And in a way, my faulty memory kind of proved a point that Takahata would often make, which is that the atom bombs are widely known of and talked about and commemorated and have become a kind of iconic moment in human history. But the firebombs, which were more widely destructive in Japan, are much less talked about and even at risk of being forgotten about. And I think that was one of his motivations in making this film, was to remind people almost that, this happened. Darian, could we have the next slide, please? Now, this isn't from Grave of the Fireflies. This is a still from Barefoot Gen, which came out a few years before and which is about the Hiroshima bomb. And I show it to make the point that animation, I think, is kind of uniquely placed to capture the sheer extreme physical effects of those atom bombs. And there's a whole corpus of animated films about that subject. And maybe because I'd seen Barefoot Gen already, I got confused between that and Grave of the Fireflies. But if we move on to the next slide, Darian, could we have the next slide, please? Yeah, this is Grave of the Fireflies, and you can see the effects of the firebomb on the building behind them. And so once I kind of digested the history of this story, I started to look at Grave of the Fireflies in a new way. I carried on watching it into my 20s, and more I started viewing it as a work of animation. It's often said about this film, as it is about any animated film that's not strictly fantasy or sci-fi, that it could have been made in live action because the things it depicts are essentially a part of the real world. And so I started watching the film with this question in my mind. Could this have been a successful live action film? And I came to think that no, it couldn't have. And there are many reasons for that, but chief among them is the fact that this film, more than others, depends for its power on the creation of vivid, plausible, empathetic child characters. In live action, casting child performers is always a bit of a gamble at the best of times. You never know exactly how they're going to perform. And I think on top of that, these two characters have storylines that span a huge emotional range, all the way from trauma to a kind of ecstatic joy when they're playing in nature together, to depression in Seita's case when he loses all hope at the end. And this would have been a very difficult performance to carry in a live action production. There's also the physical side. These children are starving to death. And I question how realistic live action could make that. Live action has a close relationship to the real world we live in, and we know intuitively what this real world looks like. And so we detect the slightest contrivance in a live action production. Whereas with animation, paradoxically, our brain knows it's artificial, and so it forgets about all these questions and just accepts it as its own reality from the beginning, and you're freed from these distractions. And on top of that, it gives Takahata's team total control over the creation of the performances. So obviously this is a hard thing to do, and that they were talented animators, but they studied how children of this age move. They also studied how people looked and how things looked at that time in history. And frame by frame, they created these incredibly plausible, realistic performances. And it also helps that the voice actors they cast in the Japanese version are very good. And maybe we can talk about that later. But I think this film made me understand, it broadened my understanding of what animation can do. I think until that point, I had thought of good animation as flamboyant animation or extreme animation with, really kind of stylized movements, things like Tex Avery or Richard Williams, Who Framed Roger Rabbit. But with Grave of the Fireflies, I came to see restrained, naturalistic animation as an end in itself, and as something that's also very difficult, and there's a lot of art to it. And then by the time I was watching the film as part of the research for my book, I was coming to it with a new perspective again, which was informed by knowing what Takahata himself and his colleagues and NOSAKA thought about the film and the story. And finding this kind of background information is actually what prompted my whole book project in the first place. So a couple of years ago, I was in Japan, and I came across this book that in a bookshop that was part of the series Ghibli no Kyokasho, Ghibli's textbooks. And each book in this series is a kind of officially sanctioned anthology of critical essays and interviews and crew reminiscences about a particular Ghibli film. And so I found the Grave of the Fireflies edition, and I bought it, started reading it, and I was really interested by what was inside it, especially by Takahata's comments, which he made in interviews and essays and in production notes. He intended many things for this film, as I said, but I came to see that he really wanted to convey a political, almost a polemical kind of critique of Japanese society. And I'll explain that. So in the film, Seita and Setsuko lose their home and move in with a distant relative who gives them shelter and helps them access food, but is also constantly nagging Seita for not doing enough for the war effort and chastising him for not being patriotic enough, etc., etc. And eventually he can't bear this anymore. And so he decides to leave her home with his sister, and they go live in a disused bomb shelter where they're free from her bad vibes, but also they are no longer plugged into the food distribution network, and they slowly die. They suffer for it. I think some viewers are moved to reflect on the degree of Seita's responsibility in this, in his death and in his sister's death. And there are many factors at play here. Firstly, how do we consider his age? He's 14 years old. Is he mature or not? Is he an adult or a child? Also, war as a context, does that explain and excuse any amount of irrational or bad decision-making? Anyway, it's a very nuanced question, and I was interested to see that Takahata took a quite emphatic position on it, which is that yes, Seita was partly responsible for what happens to him in Setsuko. Takahata actually linked the boy's bad decision-making to flaws that he perceived in the character. He saw Seita as proud and a boy with a spoiled upbringing and kind of self-centered. And not only that, but this is where Takahata kind of makes a leap. He saw in Seita's story a kind of allegory for contemporary Japanese society. So in the decades between the war and 1988, Japan had changed a lot. It had grown very wealthy, quickly recovered economically from the war, developed a kind of seemingly foolproof model of capitalism, which was praised around the world. But Takahata, who we should say was an old trade unionist and socialist-leaning person, saw a dark side to this rapid material gain. He thought that Japanese society had very quickly become much more individualistic than it used to be, much more profit-seeking, and people's sense of civic duty had kind of started to fade. And he thought that was especially true of the younger generation. And so he hoped that they would watch his film and see Seita turn his back on society and then be punished for it, and come out reflecting on their own society, their own decisions, their own behavior around other people. I think, needless to say, this is not what most viewers take away from the film. Many people see it as a straight up tragedy, find it very, very sad, and see it as a kind of statement on the horror of war, where if anyone is to blame, it's just war in the abstract, or maybe the American and the Japanese governments who are waging the war. And so I found that tension interesting. I'm not saying all this to make the point that Takahata is right in his interpretation and everyone who disagrees is wrong, not at all. I don't think that's how film interpretation works, but I still find it interesting that he had a strong message he wanted to get across, and most people didn't see the film in the same way. And that gap creates an interesting tension, which I take as the starting point for my analysis of the film in the book. Darian, if we could just have the next image, please. Yeah, I should have mentioned this earlier. So when I was talking about the difference between animation and live action, there is actually, there is something that kind of proves my point. There are two live action versions of Grave of the Fireflies. They are adaptations of the original story, not of Takahata's film, but they came out after Takahata's film. This is one of them, so that's Seita and Setsuko there. And they have their moments, these two films, but they are kind of, the performances just don't come off. They are a bit mannered and a bit stiff, and the sets look like sets and the firebombs look like effects. And that very delicate impression of reality that you get from Takahata's film collapses in these two films, if I'm honest. But they're very interesting to watch as a kind of counterexample. Darian, can we have the next slide, please? Oh yeah, okay, no, so I'll come on to this. I'm going to, before we move on to questions, I'm just going to read a little bit from my book. This passage is not about the themes of the film, it's about the production, and specifically about the approach Takahata took, in which he tried to capture a kind of authenticity of time and place, Japan in 1945, and also an authenticity in the way he creates the characters, which is what I was talking about a minute ago, and how this actually ended up placing a huge burden on the production and creating problems down the line. So I'm coming into the middle of the first chapter here. Underpinning Takahata's realism was an almost fanatical approach to research. As one of the few people on the production to remember the war, he was keen to impress the characteristics of the period on his colleagues. Together, they thoroughly investigated every aspect of the film's world, from the distinctive tint of Kobe's soil to the direction from which the US's B-29 bombers approached the city. The director provided his crew with a wealth of reference materials, including poems, photo albums, and paintings by Monet. The illustrations of Chihiro Iwasaki, notably in the book Children in the Flames of War, were a key influence on the design of Seita and Setsuko. The animators also visited a nursery to study 4-year-old girls at play. Meanwhile, the senior artists went to Kobe to scout out the story's locations. NOSAKA himself guided them, struggling with the pain it caused him to revisit these places so near to what he called the scene of the crime. And so the slide you can see there in front of you is photos from that research trip with Takahata and his colleagues standing in the locations that you then see in the film. The film's naturalism necessitated a new approach to color. Color designer Michio Yasuda believed that the gaudy hues fashionable in anime wouldn't suit the film's bummed out landscapes. Gentler, more sober palettes were called for. She created 250 colors, of which she ended up using around 150. She gave her characters relatively pale skin tones and brown outlines instead of the traditional black, so as to integrate them more harmoniously into their environments. This last innovation posed a technical problem. The carbon-based machines used to copy animators' drawings onto cells were adapted to black lines and proved unreliable when transferring brown ones. The process only became workable after much trial and error and the invention of a few ad hoc methods. The crew discovered that blowing onto the cells helped to make the lines stick. Takahata's insistence on authenticity extended to the casting. The film's dialogue is spoken in dialect, so Takahata and his sound director hired actors from Kobe and the surrounding Kansai region. Many came from live action cinema or the theatre and had little or no experience in anime. In a highly unusual move, Takahata decided that his young protagonists would be voiced by actors of the same age, not adults. 15-year-old Tsutomu Tatsumi was cast as Seita and 5-year-old Ayano Shiraishi as Setsuko. Promotional material billed Shiraishi as the youngest actor in anime history. The casting of Shiraishi necessitated another break with protocol. In the anime industry, dubbing usually takes place once the animation is more or less complete, the actors synchronizing their words to the images. Shiraishi was deemed too young to be able to do this reliably. The crew also worried that her voice might change if they waited. So she recorded the bulk of her part before production began, speaking her lines as a voice coach fed them to her. This approach ensured that her delivery was spontaneous, and the animators drew inspiration from her performance when bringing Setsuko to life. Takahata's ambitions made huge demands of his team, and the strain began to show. As the film's running time ballooned from 60 to 88 minutes, the production fell behind schedule. Where once the artists had lavished time on research and experimentation, they now cut corners. The important layout stage was eliminated, and animators began to work directly from the storyboard, all the while striving to meet Takahata's unremittingly high standards. Scenes that had been storyboarded were cut. Visiting the studio in late 1987, a reporter for Animage magazine noticed a tense atmosphere. When he returned months later, the mood had turned mournful. It became clear that Fireflies would not be finished in time. Takahata's relationships with his producers soured. Before long, he was barely on speaking terms with Toru Hara, the studio manager who had opposed the double bill in the first place. Takahata asked the production company Shinchosha to delay the release, but the company's chief executive, who must have been ruining the day he entered the film business, refused. Ultimately, Fireflies came out on time with a few unfinished sections. The sequence in which Seita is beaten for stealing vegetables was left uncolored. It was an embarrassment, the like of which the industry had never seen. Takahata's reputation was badly dented, and although Fireflies was finally completed 1 month later, he became unemployable in the animation world until Hayao MIYAZAKI symbolically lifted the ban by offering to produce his next feature. I'll stop it there, and at this point I'll ask Yoshioka Sensei to join us so that we can move on to some questions. So,
okay, sorry, it's a bit blurred. Okay, it's working. Thank you, Alex. Great presentation and indeed great book. And now let's move on to the sort of second part of tonight's event, which is going to be a discussion with myself and Alex. And I've got a few questions from the audience, which I wish to pose you toward the end. And maybe let me take liberty of asking a question of my own first. I mean, I agree with your comments on page 74 of your book. Now, this film succeeded in striking a perfect balance between realism and romanticism. And I think indeed that is Takahata's real achievement, anime making, that can be traced back all the way to earlier kind of stage of his career, like Horse or the World Masterpiece Theater. But what do you think about his later films? I mean, apparently his later films, film after this one, Grave of Fireflies, tend to be sort of criticized for focusing excessively on delivering messages or kind of experimenting with mise-en-scène or animating technique without paying not much attention to whether the audience can enjoy the film or sort of understand the meaning of the film or that sort of thing. And if I give you a few examples, for example, Miyazaki Hayao commented on Only Yesterday, saying that the way it depicts the this film Only Yesterday very explicitly praises what can be called man-made beauty of rural Japanese farming village. And Miyazaki says that the way this film Only Yesterday praises that sort of landscape sounds almost like Japanese Communist Party propaganda. And in relation to this film, a number of Japanese critics also criticized the very idealized view of rural area and life there, because especially people from Japanese countryside know that the life in this Japanese rural village is nothing like that, rosy, close-knit community. It's not just like that. But there are all sorts of difficulties and nasty sides, but apparently Takahata didn't show it, but focused more on like fantasy side of it. And as for emphasis or sympathy with the characters, if we watch Pompoko, we are almost sort of refused to emphasize or sympathize with the raccoons because we see the raccoons killing humans and so forth. And also possibly, that's also possibly because, the raccoons in that film are represented in different ways. Sometimes they appear as manga-like characters. Sometimes they appear more like animals as they are seen from human beings. So there's no kind of fixed shape of raccoons in that film. So, I thought maybe, it's a bit difficult for us to emphasize or sympathize with the characters, just like we do in The Grave of Fireflies. And Oshii Mamoru, he's the director of films like Ghost in the Shell or Mobile Postpaid Labor. He even says that Takahata, after Grave of Fireflies, this is not a very nice word, but let me just quote it as he puts it. He calls Takahata kuso interi, or wretched intellectual, because after this film, he continuously creates film as a quasi-intellectual, public intellectual who cares more about getting his message across and just trying to, experiment with film language and that sort of thing instead of creating meaningful or understandable message with some sort of message. So I'm wondering what you think about kind of effectiveness of films after this one in relation to giving kind of packaging drama with meaningful message.
Yeah, that's a funny quote from Mamoru Oshii. He's one of the few really high-profile people in the anime industry who enjoys relentlessly criticizing Ghibli. He's also very close to them. He worked with them at some point, and yeah, he's often quite blunt in his commentary. I don't agree that Takahata's later films are not entertaining. I find them really entertaining. The one in particular that I come back to over and over again is My Neighbours the Yamadas, which is not really a kind of straight through narrative film. It's more like a collection of sketches about a very ordinary family and their very ordinary little problems and hang-ups, but also their ordinary joys and loves. And as a fan of The Simpsons, I mean this is a compliment, I often see elements of The Simpsons in that film. And in fact, one of the few times I met Takahata, I said that to him, and I asked him whether he liked The Simpsons, and he said he wasn't that interested in it. So if there's a link there, it's mostly in my head. And what was the other thing? Oh yeah, you said that Miyazaki criticized Only Yesterday for being a kind of a borderline propagandistic portrait of an idealized village in the countryside. Again, it's funny to hear Miyazaki say that, because I don't know that quote. I don't know in what context he said it, but Miyazaki himself often idealizes the countryside too. And this, incidentally, is the film that Miyazaki offered to produce to kind of help bring Takahata back into the industry. And so Miyazaki himself worked closely on that film Only Yesterday. I find them entertaining, but I mean, I find them watchable in the way that Grave of the Fireflies is watchable. You can't really describe Grave of the Fireflies as straightforward entertainment because it's difficult to watch. And one of the things I appreciate in Takahata's work is he doesn't shy away from showing the complexities of human behavior, human psychology, which then kind of filter through into complex societies, complex social interactions. The village in Only Yesterday may be very pretty, but the characters in it are not too idealized, I think, or at least the main characters are not. You really have access to their thoughts, and you see them behaving awkwardly with each other and so on. And I always find this engaging when I see that. And if I'm honest, I find it rare to see that in animated films. And I think it was even rarer 30 years ago when Takahata was making these films. What else? Oh yeah, Pompoko you mentioned as well. That's one of his later films. That's the one I've often found the most difficult to get along with. Again, he's slightly experimental with his storytelling structure there. The story is kind of cyclical in a way. You have these raccoons or raccoon dogs, I should say, tanuki, who are kind of staging, or they're kind of brainstorming different ways to undermine human society from their kind of base camp. And then they go out and do whatever mission they've come up with. And then they come back to base camp and celebrate their success or lament their failure. And then it repeats. And that kind of story pattern kind of repeats a few times. And I can see what Takahata is doing with that. I think he wants to try and create a sense of ritualistic repetition in the Tanuki society. Their lives go around with the seasons and come back to where they are, and you get the impression that this has been going on for eons, while human society has suddenly popped up out of nowhere and is moving at warp speed and encroaching on their territory. But I find that a bit irritating, if I'm honest, when I see the film, and it's quite a long film, about 2 hours, I think. I find it a little bit monotonous. But all his other films after Grave of the Fireflies, I love and rewatch regularly. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. Maybe it's the beginning of an answer. Do you personally find his later films difficult to watch?
To be brutally honest, I do. I had problem. I enjoy is not the right word here, but certainly I understand what's going on in terms of the message and so forth in relation to Grave of Fireflies, and I do agree that this film is not just about anti-war thing, but it's actually kind of social critique, and that tends to be often kind of breed underneath this ideological discussion about a film when it comes to academic debate. But I agree with your remark on Pompoko, and actually I remembered my mate, he's my best friend, he also likes anime, but he said that he cannot really watch Pompoko because it's after watching that he's sort of numbed. He doesn't understand what the kind of ultimate message is. So after spending how long was it, almost 2 hours, and he's like, okay, so what does he want to say? And, that's the sort of reaction I personally tend to have. And I also tend to think that the My Neighbour Yamada is very difficult to watch because it doesn't have real, structure as such. But I really enjoyed his very last film, the Tale of Princess Career, and that was absolutely marvelous in terms of the mise en scène, and also it's got a very clear sort of storyline and message and so forth. I'm not 100% sure whether there's any social critique in it as such, because social criticism was always important for Takahata. And that's why I asked this question, because before, in the 80s and 90s, Takahata continuously criticized Miyazaki for being escapist. His film is not making meaningful or significant social criticism, and he said he's using fantasy as sort of escape, but using it as a tool to criticize contemporary Japanese society, which Takahata says that he did in Nausicaa, but he stopped doing that after Totoro. So I'm not sure whether the Princess Kaguya has same sort of critical edge in terms of contemporary Japanese society, but still I did enjoy the film because of its power and also general kind of drama and such. But, what do you think about this aspect of social criticism? Obviously, Pompoko does have very strong sense of social criticism, and the Only Yesterday seems to have some, but to be honest, I'm not very sure about what their message there is, because criticism about about Only Yesterday is that Takahata is creating this film from urbanized point of view. He's saying Inaka is great, countryside is great, as it is seen from urbanized, and he doesn't say how difficult it is to live in these places, or how exhausting to work in rural village. And one criticism is that why doesn't he use farm which grows rice? Why did he use that benibana farming family? And one, actually, this is Oshimamo who said this, and Oshimamo says that the possible answer is simply benibana farming house looks more prettier and it's more effective to attract female young audience, which is the main target audience. But what do you think about this issue of social criticism? Do you think his film always had this social criticism edge even after Only Yesterday? Or...
Yeah, I think Only Yesterday. So Takahata has a tendency sometimes to be a little bit didactic in how he makes his points, and I think Only Yesterday is a good example of that coming through. There are a couple of moments where one of the characters makes almost like a speech in which they spell out. You can kind of hear Takahata speaking his own political views through the mouth of a character. So, for example, you have a farmer showing his organic farm and saying how great organic farming is compared to conventional farming, and so on. And those moments, they feel didactic, and I can see how you would, some viewers would find that off-putting, especially if they don't agree with Takahata's politics. I'm trying to think of his other films. I think Only Yesterday is somewhere where I especially felt that. And then, of course, the great 3-hour live-action documentary he made just before Grave of the Fireflies about a medieval waterway system in a Japanese city in Kyushu, which was a real passion project for him, and I think for him alone, pretty much. He went to film the local councillors, kind of some of them were fighting to clean up the waterways, and some people were getting, some citizens were getting active in that as well. And there are long stretches where, you've just got talking heads talking about the importance of having clean water and so on. A little bit didactic sometimes. And what strikes me in Grave of the Fireflies is that it's not didactic at all. In a film like this, with really dramatic war things happening, you would almost expect at some point, maybe around the climax, a character standing up and delivering a monologue about the horrors of war or about the stupidity of the government or of humanity or whatever. And Grave of the Fireflies completely sidesteps that. It never goes there. There are no speeches. The dialogue is very much focused on mundane things. and then on the kind of sheer anxiety of needing food. But no one really speaks for a long stretch of time in the film. You have an aunt, well, they call her an aunt, she's a distant relative, making speeches at the characters, you know, about how they're not patriotic enough. But that's not the same thing, really. That's not a mouthpiece for the director's views. That's an element of her characterization as a very difficult person. And so, yeah, the film, as I say in my book, I think Takahata definitely wanted to say some political things about how Japanese society was acting now and had acted then. And I think the film contains enough kind of, it gives you enough to kind of piece that together if you really watch it carefully. But it's in a way so subtle that it failed to do what the director wanted it to do. Many people, it kind of goes over their heads. And I think also because of a lot of the elements in the film that convey some of the political and historical context are very easy to miss, especially if you don't read Japanese or don't have a real grounding in that period of Japanese history. I'll just give you one example. In the film, Seita, what is it? He's taken to a police station. He steals from a farmer who catches him and drags him to a police station. And there's a kind of conflict between the policeman and the farmer, and everyone's being hostile to each other. And you've just got this sense of society completely collapsing. And just kind of over them on the wall, there's this big sign with the Japanese kanji reading Hakkoichi, which is an imperial slogan that refers to kind of harmony under the Japanese dominion. And the irony of it is very, very striking, but for that you have to read that sign, and it's almost a blink and you'll miss it thing, and it's in kanji as well, and it's not translated in the subtitles. He seeds these kind of subtle criticisms of the Japanese imperial ideology, but they are very, very subtle and they move very quickly. So yeah, Grave of the Fireflies is interesting to compare it with, I think, Only Yesterday, especially to see how Takahata delivers his politics. Also, just to come back to what you said, Mamoru Oshii said about calling Takahata a bloody intellectual. Again, I'm not sure exactly what the context is there, but Takahata was not just a filmmaker, he was also a kind of public intellectual. He wrote a lot of essays, which have all been kind of condensed into a couple of big, heavy volumes of his writing. He wrote books, he gave speeches at NGOs, and especially pacifist anti-war NGOs, and in schools as well. And he would appear on the radio and talk about these subjects. And his persona as a public intellectual is quite intellectual. It really is. He's often quite pedantic. His essays can be very, very long. And in that sense, he contrasts with Miyazaki, who also in some ways is a public intellectual, but who's much more, who I think is a bit lighter in the way he delivers his ideas. And Miyazaki's writings are much more anecdotal, and dare I say, more fun to read. So maybe Mamoru Oshii was also referring to Takahata's kind of role as that as well. And so for my book, actually, a lot of my research was combing through Takahata's writings about the war. He wrote and gave speeches about the war without even mentioning Grave of the Fireflies often, or just mentioning it at the beginning. But he had a whole kind of system of thought about how Japanese state and Japanese society should be thinking about war and pacifism. And he really was committed to it, you know, into his late 70s and early 80s. He was still writing op-eds in the newspaper or giving interviews about this subject. Maybe that rubbed Mamoru Oshii up the wrong way, I don't know.
Yeah, he is, I mean, Takahata is an intellectual because he's graduate of Todai and Tokyo University, and he went to French department, and he's very fluent in French, and so he is an intellectual. But the context here is that I want to pick up one question in the audience, so I want to cut this as short as possible. But you know, the context here is that Oshii is saying that Takahata is trying to create a film just to say things instead of create drama and put a message on it. So, possibly, the way, this film, as you said, is not kind of didactic, whereas in his later films, as you said, only yesterday, he begins to, show this speech, so to speak, and not, to him, to Oshii Mamoru, it was sort of, stinks, as if it's more like propaganda, and that's what he meant by intellectual. And as you said, toward the end of his life, especially, after, to be honest, the failure, commercial failure of My Neighbour Yamada's, he was basically just intellectual rather than filmmaker. He was involved in producing some anime, and also he wrote extensively about animation and such, but not about Japanese animation, but more about French animation and also Japanese medieval art. So he did become more of an intellectual. So that's the kind of another context we can take into consideration when we think about this issue of Takahata's intellectual. And that's very interesting to think about. But can I've got one question where I want to pose, which is from the audience. So let me just, instead of just going on with this issue of intellectual, let me just read this one. It's from Rose. She asked, do you think there's a difference between the response of Western viewers and Japanese viewers when it comes to Takahata's interpretation of Seita in the film? I'm wondering if the evaluation of the Japanese experience in World War II causes a tendency in Western audience to be more towards seeing it as a tragedy and missing some of the nuance of Takahata's commentary on Japan's growth.
It's an interesting question and quite a difficult one to answer. I did a number of things for the research for my book. I read a lot of reviews of the film, both in English and in Japanese, reviews from the time when the film came out in the two respective territories, and also more recent reviews. I also read a lot of Takahata's own reactions to the feedback he got in Japan. He never talks about how people interpreted the film overseas, but he talks a lot about how Japanese audiences spoke about the film to him. And then also just anecdotally, I asked everyone I knew who'd seen the film what they thought about it. My Japanese friends and colleagues, also my friends and colleagues here in the UK. And if I'm honest, I don't know if there is a huge difference in how people come down on the main subject we're talking about here, which is to what extent you see the film as a critique of Japanese society or just as a tearjerker or a very sad film with no particular moral or political stance. No, I found that in both among Japanese reviews / Japanese friends and in the UK and other territories, the majority of people just kind of emphasized how very sad the film is and how some people say it's unbearable to watch and too sad and so on. And then in both cases, a minority of people taking a slightly different position, for example, saying that they felt intense anger towards Seita for the way he made decisions and was stubborn, or a lot of anger towards the relative, the aunt, for her nastiness and hostility to them, and so on. Takahata himself, he wrote about how he was a little surprised and I think a little dismayed. You can kind of tell from his tone that the initial audience in 1988 did not particularly react. I think he accepts that many people kind of wanted to talk about the morality of Seita and the other characters, but certainly very few people thought that the film's storyline had anything to do with their lives now in 1988. And I can understand that. I mean, it's a big leap for him to make. It's quite an idiosyncratic reading of the story. And speaking personally, my upbringing was quite similar in a way to Japanese children of the 1980s, in that I grew up in a materialistic, fairly well-off society here in the UK with no experience of war. War to me seems like something very, very remote. And I think it's the same probably for the generation growing up in Japan in the 80s, even though their parents had lived through war, their grandparents. And from that perspective, war seems so extreme, so awful, that my impulse is to kind of excuse a lot of what people do in it, what the civilians do, because I think it's not my place to judge them, especially as I don't know it I've never been through that myself. And sure enough, that's the reaction Takahata seemed to get from a lot of his audience. He said so. Also in a book which Ghibli has published, which includes a lot of archive material, you find all these wonderful letters that school children had written to Takahata after watching the film in the 80s and 90s. There's about 24 of these letters. And I think all of them, or pretty much all of them, just are variations on war is sad. I'm so sad for these children and I wish they'd lived. Maybe it's too much to expect school children to come away with a very, very nuanced take on the morality of the characters, but then again, that's kind of what Takahata was hoping they would do. So no, in answer to the question, I'm not aware of a huge, clear difference. There are obviously variations. I think I've spoken to Americans who say that watching the film made them realize that their country had done this in the 40s and they weren't even aware of it. I'm talking about the firebombing. And they would say to me, you know, this is awful. Like, I can't believe my country did that. It's indiscriminate. And, you know, I regret that. Well, you know, that they found that a blot on their nation's history. Something else I noticed is that in a few cases when I read reviews by or spoke to people I know from countries that were formerly part of the Japanese Empire, they often took umbrage at the way the film seems to show the Japanese as victims, at least in their eyes. And they found that very difficult to bear because they knew what their country had been through at the hands of the Japanese. And they found that a film that shows the Japanese suffering without mentioning what the Japanese did to others was unjustifiable. That's the reaction I got in some cases there. And in fact, the film, I think, when was it? It was initially meant to come out in South Korea with a lot of delay, I think in around 2004, 2005. And there was a huge uproar in South Korea against the film because many people knew what it was or had seen it pirated or knew the subject matter and reacted to this idea that the film should come and play in their cinemas. And the release of the film was delayed by many, many years. And I can't remember the exact years now in my head, but there was actually that level of backlash against it. So that's a kind of subsection of the reaction to the film, which I found very interesting as well. Yeah.
I found that very interesting because I do show this film as a part of my module on anime for almost 10 years. And the reaction is sort of mixed back. Sometimes most of the students are from the UK, and we do have some students from other countries, but most of them are from this country. And I found it quite interesting because sometimes they, as you said, they blame Seita and they say that, well, it's ultimately his fault because he should have bent his knees to his auntie, and then they could have survived. But but some other people say that this, as you said, this film is trying to not evade but doesn't depict Japanese responsibility, and some other people simply say that it's too sad, kawaiso, that sort of thing. So it's really a mixed bag. So I found it quite interesting, and just to kind of adding to that, is there any sort of the way people watch? I mean, I know that Takahata is very famous in France, and possibly that's because he's got this very strong connection with France as a person and his personal background and so forth. But compared with that, Takahata is very little known in this country. compared with Miyazaki. So is there any particular reason for that, do you think? Why is he, so this is true in Japan, but I think it's more so in this country and sort of possible in the States too. But do you think is there any special kind of factors behind this less, kind of kind of fame of Takahata? So why is he less famous, do you think?
Yeah, so a couple of reasons. It is strange because many of his films are now accessible in the UK and are associated with Studio Ghibli, which is hugely famous. I should add that a lot of his works are not accessible in the UK. There are maybe 3 features he made in the 80s, plus basically all the series he directed in the 70s, because for a long time he was a TV series director that have never been officially released in the UK, but were widely shown in some European countries. And so that contributed to his fame there. So firstly, we do want to have all of his stuff here. And I think there are rights issues, but I also know that people are working hard to try and resolve them. Anyway, that said, we are left with about 6 or 7 of his most famous films, which are available here. I find them entertaining, I find them fascinating, but there is some truth to, I think, the fact that some of them are not as straightforwardly kind of conceived as entertainment films for the whole family as Miyazaki's films are. That's a generalization, but there's something to that. Also, maybe this is a factor that you touched on this earlier, they're maybe less visually coherent. Takahata is more experimental visually, especially in his later films, and that might make it that little bit harder to see his work as a unified body of work and see him as an auteur. I think he is, but I think maybe that's less immediately obvious. Than with Miyazaki. I mean, Miyazaki's, then there's a question of kind of publicity, branding, marketing. Miyazaki's films have done crazy numbers at the box office in Japan. Several of the most successful films of all time in Japan are his. He's won an Oscar, and the whole kind of distribution machine outside Japan has rallied behind him and has really kind of pushed him as a brand. And it's actually quite interesting to see how the Miyazaki brand and the Ghibli brand intersect and kind of interact with each other. They're not exactly the same thing, but they overlap a lot. And Takahata's kind of left out of that. His films have generally not done as well at the box office. Miyazaki is also a more charismatic presence, I think. This is maybe more of a factor in Japan, I don't know, but he is quite a charismatic person when he talks or when he writes. And while Takahata, while very perceptive often and very insightful, I think was not so charismatic and less of a media presence. And so that might have, in a small way, contributed also to the difference between them. Takahata was he was quite retiring as well. This is not necessarily how he was when at work, when in the studio, when directing his team. But the times I met him, and also just seeing him behave in public, he was quite self-effacing. There would be a crowded room at a festival or whatever, and he would just be kind of stood on the sidelines, just, in an anonymous blazer or whatever, just kind of standing there, not talking to anyone. So he didn't really draw attention to himself much. And yeah, I think all of this plays into it. But ultimately, I don't know, a bit of all those things that I just said. I think the main thing now is we need access to his remaining films and to the series, the big series. But I don't know how much difference that will, I don't know. Yeah, these are all pre-Ghibli works, but I can see a situation in which they'd be released in the UK and kind of branded with a pseudo Ghibli branding, like this is what the Ghibli geniuses made before Ghibli or whatever. And that would get quite a lot of publicity. So I hope that comes soon. And I also look forward to more writing about Takahata, more scholarship on him. because he's been sidelined in academia compared to Miyazaki, I think, for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, possibly, I don't know, but it's I find it interesting because even Miyazaki films, possibly the first Miyazaki films, which was kind of popularly released in the West, was Princess Mononoke when it was distributed by Disney, and which is going to be a kind of subject of talk at the New York version of this talk tomorrow, I think. But when that happened, the Miyazaki film was kind of branded more as a kind of art film, so to speak, and was distributed and shown as such. But later, I don't think that's no longer the case. People tend to watch it not simply as art as such, but more like kind of entertainment in a way. But when I think about Takahata films, probably it's going to stay in the area of art, so to speak, because the factors you mentioned, like the way the look, it differs from one to another, and it's got a more complex storyline, and also possibly the fact that his film is just the only permanent exhibit at the New York's Museum of Modern Art as animated film. All this sort of thing could be sort of like adding, kind of building up the image of Takahata as someone intellectual whose work is more difficult than Hayao, and it's for upmarket, so to speak, more like art film. So I'm very curious to see whether it's going to, when his films, his earlier works are released, and there's more, so to speak, discourse on Takahata Isao as a film director and animator and person, then what sort of thing is going to happen in the UK and also possibly in the States? Because in France, I think there's that sort of discourse already. He's an established figure, so to speak. People do have their own image about Takahata Isao. His films are quite famous. And that's same in continental Europe, because in the past I had some students from continental Europe, like France, Germany, and they say that they watch Takahata TV series when in their childhood. But interestingly, they didn't know that these films, TV animations were by Takahata unless I explain that to them when I showed the wave of Fireflies. But as you said, they do know these things. So as soon as they hear the name, they find out. But I'm sort of wondering what's the prospect here it's going to be once his films are getting released. Do you think it's he's going to be accepted in the same way as Miyazaki, or is it going to be a bit different? Is he going to be stay in some sort of a more artistic area?
Yeah, I think another thing I would add is that Miyazaki was kind of trained in so many of the aspects of visual development and production in animation. He did layouts, he did the storyboards, animation. Takahata doesn't do any of these things. He just directs and writes, for the most part, with some exceptions. But Miyazaki specifically is a brilliant character designer. He has an incredible flair for designing worlds and characters, and some of his most enduring characters, like Totoro is the most obvious example, become famous in and of themselves, but then they were associated with Miyazaki and not Takahata. Those kinds of things can then be marketed, and that feeds the Miyazaki brand. Takahata does not design characters visually. He doesn't invent fantasy creatures in the way Miyazaki does. And so I think that's a real factor behind Miyazaki's films doing well and Miyazaki himself becoming this kind of cult figure. Yeah.
Okay, the Q&A is exploding, so I'm trying to go through it now.
Yeah.
I'm possibly you have to. I'm not sure how much time we have. Not much. So, I actually I've got this one question which I want to. This is a very long question, but actually I meant to ask this question, sort of something related to this one. So let me just read one probably final question from Michelle. Who says the Grave of Fireflies seems to have set the trend of anti-war anime, not focus on innocent children suffering Japanese island in this corner of the world, to use them symbolically as innocent victims of an abstract war instead of addressing the actual causes of war and the Japanese responsibility. But as you said, Takahata's film, in fact, addresses responsibilities and even shows Seta as having nationalist ideas. Seeing the scene, the life, the Fireflies shape, the warship his father moved out on. Do you have any thoughts on how the movie rates the questionable responsibility? Is it addressed in Japanese reception? Let me just add one thing. How do you compare this film with this corner of the world, which in this corner of the world, which Michelle also mentioned?
Yeah, no, the questioner is right. There are lots of films of this type, basically children suffering in World War II, were released after Grave of the Fireflies, some even before, like Barefoot Gen is one example. I think that can partly be attributed to Grave of the Fireflies' impact. And also there are other things like the kind of the 50-year commemorations of the war began shortly after Grave of the Fireflies came out. And I think a lot of films were made around that time to commemorate those events. But yeah, in their kind of narrative shape, they're often very similar to Grave of the Fireflies. You have children. The story often really properly begins around the time when the war starts to turn, the tide of war starts to turn against Japan. And then it focuses on those last couple of months or last year or so where, you know, stuff is really going badly and the bombs start raining down. Some of them are about the atomic bombs, some of them are about the fire bombs, some are about neither, but about some other aspect of that period of the war. It's something of a genre, and there are many tropes that repeat across them. One of them is very often, well, I think it's no coincidence that the characters are often children, because it's much easier to tell a sentimental story and maybe avoid some of the more difficult questions about responsibility when you're focusing on children who have less agency, moral agency, and less responsibility than adults. We generally agree on that. But more than that, a lot of these films end up very much, in my view, idealizing those main characters, those children usually, sometimes adults, and making them seem very, very virtuous and almost kind of detaching the characters from the context. It's like they are just, it's like bombs start raining down on them almost like a natural disaster, and then they're just suffering from those and trying to cope with the damage. I absolutely understand the impulse to commemorate people who suffered and died in the war. This is something every country does. The UK does it as well, and there's nothing wrong with that in and of itself. But what I find a lot of these films lacks, but Grave of the Fireflies has, is a willingness to confront some of the complex truths about that time, such as that, you know, a lot of civilians who had been kind of cocooned in propaganda for years and decades were very much in favor of the war. And you see in Grave of the Fireflies how even at this bitter end of the war, the characters, a lot of them are still holding on to this idea of the great Japanese Empire. And the film kind of cleverly suggests how that faith in the country actually contributes to their bad decisions. So I'm not saying this to say that, you know, all the characters in Grave of the Fireflies are bad or stupid, not at all. But they do behave with the complexities and flaws of people, humans in general. And I find that fascinating. And I find it very much lacking in a lot of these other war films, which seem to exist mostly just to commemorate the suffering of people, and also maybe to just remind children of some of the basic facts about the war, you know, the kind of historical order of events, like Pearl Harbor happened here, and then the air sirens started going off, the air raid sirens started going off in this month, and then the bombs started falling in this month. And there's something quite kind of, yeah, I don't know, just kind of formulaic about them. Also on a storytelling level, a problem I had with a lot of these films is that they don't have a very strong narrative structure because they rely on just the progress of the war as the narrative. So instead of really thinking about creating storylines and character arcs for the protagonists, they just start at Pearl Harbor or wherever and then kind of box check all of the key events in the war until the end of the war, and sometimes a little bit beyond the end of the war. And that's not a very satisfying storytelling structure, whereas Grave of the Fireflies has this structure which is tragic and very, very traumatic and difficult to watch, but also very strong as a story of the children's deaths, which we learn about at the beginning. And then we're left in this state of horrible suspense and kind of mixture of suspense and fatalism, knowing that eventually they're going to die. So yeah, so I'm kind of lost in my own train of thought here. But yeah, but that's not to say that there are no other good war films in anime at all. I think some of them are very good. I'd recommend Barefoot Gen and its sequel. They're based on a famous manga by Keiji Nakazawa, which is also brilliant. And they tell a lot of very harsh truths about that period in history. Not always in a very flattering way, but always in a strong, dramatic way. So yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you for now. It's we've just run out of time for today. So thank you for the participant, the audience who sent the huge number of questions. Sorry, we cannot pick them. But I went through these questions, and some of these are definitely answered in the book itself. So that's why I didn't pick up some of the highest rated questions, because I know after reading the book, I know that you can find answers to these in the book. So if you double my eyes, please do read the book if you haven't done so, because you can find answers to a number of questions you asked in that book. So thank you very much for Alex for the great discussion and all the participants. And now I'm going to return the stage, give up the stage to Junko-san for the final wrap up.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. First of all, thanks, Alex, for your very insightful information about Isao Takahata. Most of them, I didn't know, so I learned quite a lot. I just noted, oh, I see. So it was really insightful. And also that together with that Dr. Yoshioka, that was really interesting because you know, as expert on anime, that you have managed to input quite a lot, and then and Alex echoed to that comment that Dr. Yoshioka mentioned, and then answered question that was very intellectual and very informative session. So thank you so much. And I know that some of you audience are from United States, so unfortunately, you can't really, ask that your question from your perspective in person. But I hope that this session has sort of answered some of your questions. Sorry, it's actually nature of that very popular event where there is a lot of questions. We don't really have much time, but as Dr. Yoshioka says, probably answer is there in the book. So please purchase the book. We already mentioned that discount code, but Darian, can you show the discount code as well? Yeah, can you see that discount code? It's actually limited offer until that 25th of June. We haven't got any commission from this Bloomsbury in the publisher, but I simply think that this good book. Alex, do you have a book, with you now?
Copy of it. Yeah, I do actually. I should have. I can't. Hang on, I've lost sight of my own screen, but can you see it there?
Yeah, we can see that. Yeah, we can see.
So, yeah, there it is. Loads of nice images. So yeah, definitely worth it.
And that's interesting. I mean, I'm always intrigued how that a younger generation actually think about this, film, because my generation is those who haven't experienced the war, but heard quite a lot from my parents. Certainly, my parents talked about the war quite a lot to me as a younger child. But probably, current sort of younger generation may take this film differently. So I had a really sort of related to somehow, pseudo related to this work, but I'm not really sure how the younger generation will take. But I think this work, in many ways, is brilliant work. And I hope that together with Alex's book, many people will watch this film for the many years to come. I think the film, this work needs to stay with us in that human history, in my opinion. So that's all from me. Darian, do you have any other slides or something we show? Oh, one thing I need to tell, because Reina Denison is one of the audience today. I know, Reina, thank you for joining us. Tomorrow, my colleagues in New York will have an interesting talk about Studio Ghibli together with Reina Denison from Eastern Korea University. It's actually conveniently from 7 o'clock UK time. So if you have any time to join our New York office and talk event tomorrow, please do so. I highly recommend it. So that's all from me. Thank you so much. And then I hope you enjoy. Yeah, there is actually a link there. If you have time to quickly copy and paste. Yeah, that's all from me. So thank you so much. Have a nice evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for coming. Thanks.